All right, let's dive into a topic that's always making waves in Canada. The idea of Alberta separating. Is it a real possibility, or is there something else entirely going on? It's a huge question, packed with politics, emotion, and some seriously complex legal stuff. So, let's get into it.
So, let's just cut to the chase. Could it really happen? Could Alberta, one of the country's economic engines, actually just leave? That is the big question we're tackling today. We're going to break down the legal realities, the political drama, and what the source material suggests might be the real story behind the headlines.
Now, at the center of this recent push is Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith and her United Conservative Party. She's been talking about more independence for Alberta for a long time, and things like her Alberta Sovereignty Act, which is designed to challenge federal laws, have definitely put the whole separation idea right back in the spotlight.
But before we get caught up in all the political talk, we've got to start with the bedrock of it all, the law. Because when you're talking about a province leaving Confederation, Canada's own constitution has a whole lot to say. And here's the first major roadblock, and it's a big one. A province can't just decide on its own to pack up and go. It's unconstitutional. The Supreme Court of Canada was crystal clear about this back in 1998. They ruled that for a province to leave, it would mean changing the actual constitution, and that's a process that involves a lot more than just one province's government.
And in response to that court decision, the federal government didn't just leave things to chance. They went ahead and passed something called the Clarity Act. Think of it as the official rule book. It lays out a super strict, very specific set of conditions that have to be met before Ottawa would even come to the negotiating table.
And when you look at that rule book, wow, it's a real legal gauntlet. First, you need a referendum with a clear question, no tricky wording. Then you need a clear majority to vote yes. But here's the real kicker. The House of Commons in Ottawa gets to decide if the question was clear enough and if the majority was big enough. And even if you clear all that, then you have to start negotiations with every single other province, the Senate, and Indigenous peoples. It's a massive undertaking.
But okay, let's just imagine for a second. Against all odds they clear all those hurdles. There's another layer to this, and honestly, it's a constitutional barrier that might be the biggest one of all.
This is so fundamental. You have to understand that almost all of Alberta is treaty land. We're talking about historic, nation-to-nation agreements between the Crown and First Nations. And these are not just dusty old documents. They are living agreements that are protected by Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. A province can't just wipe those rights away by deciding to leave the country that those treaties were made with.
So what does that actually mean? Well, it's not just about, having a chat or a consultation. The law, both in Canada and internationally, says it requires free, prior, and informed consent from the First Nations involved. And that, for all intents and purposes, is a veto. Without that green light, the entire legal argument for separating on that land just falls apart.
So, you pile up all these constitutional walls, these massive legal barriers, and what do you get? Well, the source analysis gives the actual likelihood of Alberta ever separating just 1 star out of 5.
And that 1-star rating isn't just a random number. It really reflects what pretty much all the legal experts say. The Edmonton Journal summed up the consensus perfectly. The chances are as close to 0 as you could possibly get.
But wait a second. What about a wild card, right? Could a powerful force from the outside change all this? Like, what if a U.S. president decided they wanted Alberta to join them?
And that's not just a hypothetical, is it? Because we've seen this talk coming from south of the border. The sources we're looking at note that President Trump, during his second term, has thrown out the idea of annexing Canada, or at least parts of it. And he often ties this kind of talk to threats of major economic tariffs.
So, does all that fiery talk actually change anything on the ground? Well, the short answer is no. The Canadian government has flat out rejected it as offensive and impossible. Premier Smith herself has condemned it. You've got no real support for it in the U.S. Congress. And Indigenous leaders are overwhelmingly against it.
So, we check back in on that feasibility rating, and guess what? Even with all this unprecedented talk from a world leader, it hasn't budged an inch, still 1 star.
According to this analysis, the Trump factor, as real as the rhetoric is, doesn't actually change the legal or political reality of separation.
And that, right there, brings us to the most fascinating question in this whole explainer. If separation is practically impossible, then why on earth are we all talking about it so much? Let's ask that question directly. If the destination isn't a real place you can get to, what is the point of the whole journey? This is where the source material we're drawing from says you have to look behind the curtain.
And here is the theory in a nutshell. On one side, you have the debate we hear about all the time: separation, fighting Ottawa, so-called Western alienation. But the analysis suggests this is all a distraction, a cover story for a completely different agenda on the other side: a major push for privatization, a weakening of democratic rules, and cuts to public services.
The term the source material uses is pretty blunt. An analysis from Read the Maple calls the separatism talk a smokescreen. It argues the whole point is to distract everybody from other, very real things that are happening, and it specifically calls out an aggressive move to privatize parts of the healthcare system.
And this isn't just a wild theory. The sources point to some specific evidence. They highlight the simultaneous push for more private, for-profit health clinics. They describe what they call a pattern of misinformation and gaslighting to keep people angry at the federal government. They also point out it's a smart political move to keep the more extreme separatist wing of the UCP party happy and in the fold. And all this is happening while polls consistently show most Albertans don't actually want to separate.
So, let's go back to our rating system one last time. What is the likelihood that this whole separation debate is actually a deliberate political deflection campaign? The analysis gives that a 5-star rating, a near certainty.
So at the end of the day, the conclusion from the source material is that this isn't really about leaving Canada at all. It's about using the threat of leaving as a powerful political tool, a vehicle to drive forward a much bigger market-based overhaul of Alberta, in a way the analysis argues could put democratic accountability at risk.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty provocative thought, one that's useful well beyond just this one issue. When is a political debate not actually about the topic being debated? And more importantly, what might it be distracting all of us from? That's definitely something to think about the next time a huge, polarizing issue dominates the news. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.